Well, every weekend we go home, and I'm about to go back to Wisconsin for a couple more weeks. And when we get back home, of course, we always talk to our constituents. I'd like to address my speech tonight to the issue that is most on their mind. Now, when we go back to Wisconsin in June, we spend a lot of time on what they call breakfast on the farm. Because June is Dairy Promotion Month in Wisconsin, and with Dairy Promotion Month, there are breakfasts on the farm in which you have an opportunity to see so many of your constituents. When back home, I'm going to go through the number one, number two issues. The number one issue is gasoline inflation. I mean, everybody talks about it. They talk about how it's squeezing their budget, about how they're not able to go on trips as much as they used to. They've got to cut back on the type of food that they buy. So number one would be gas inflation. I suppose number two would be food inflation, as they talk about having to buy, cuts of meat that aren't as good or other food products that aren't as good as they were before. And I think probably number three is housing inflation. You look for a new house now and it costs so much more than it did a year ago. I personally believe there are other issues that are as significant and perhaps in the long term more significant for America. Are we going to wrap up Ukraine, or what are we going to do at our border? What are we going to do about the over 110,000 people are dying of drug overdoses every year? But obviously, in my district, the number one issue is inflation. And I want to talk about how we got there. How did we get there? Any middle school C student should know that inflation is caused by excessive government spending, which has to be covered by the Federal Reserve. What are President Biden's signature accomplishments? First of all, a $1.9 trillion bill called the American Rescue Plan, right out of the chute. His second biggest accomplishment was a $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill. These bills were in addition to an excessively spending regular appropriation bill. What would happen was as predictable as night following day. Multiple Republicans, including myself, warned last January and February against out-of-control inflation. Larry Summers, Barack Obama's director of the National Economic Council, called this bill the worst economic policy in the last 20 years. But whatever Larry Summers said was ignored, as sadly the majority party charged again, spending $1.9 trillion that America did not have. So now we're told that we have the worst inflation in 40 years at 8.3%. Don't believe that 8.3 number. It's much worse than that, and it always bothers me when people say we have such a problem at 8.3% inflation. It's just so much more. Changes to inflation calculation over the years have grossly underestimated the real number. I'm going to lead off with housing. And when I look at housing, I talk to builders, I talk to landlords, I talk to real estate brokers. Housing is listed at a 5.5% increase in the last year. Ask any of these people if rents or new construction have gone up only 5.5% in the last year, and they will laugh at you. And 5.5% is what the government is telling people it's at. When I talk to builders, they tell me that a new house this year can cost 30% more than what that same house was going last year. And rents are clearly well over the 5.5% figure as well. But government, for whatever reason, does not use the cost of new construction. They use what they refer to as the rental value of your new house, which is a much lower number. I have a graph here showing the difference between the actual rent and the CPI rent. And you can see here that there's about a 15% gap, and that the actual rent has gone up about 15% more than the so-called CPI number, which has gone up as well. So that's one of the reasons why I think if Americans feel that they're in worse shape than only an 8.6 inflation, that is true. I also want to point out that these numbers are only updated once every 6 months. That's one of the problems. Although another problem we have is when they talk about the cost of housing, which usually would mean buying a house, they do not take into account the cost of interest on a mortgage for whatever reason. Well, in the last year, as interest rates have gone up, again, partly because of the inflation, The interest cost on a 30-year fixed mortgage has gone up 39%. A 39% increase in interest payments on the house, assuming the cost of the house hasn't gone up at all. But is that in the equation? No. When we calculate inflation, we do not take into account the massively higher interest rates that you have to pay now compared to the past. The next, and by the way, as we look at things like housing, I beg the press corps to do a little bit of research. Don't just report this 8.3% number. You know, you have the ability to talk to the brokers, to talk to the grocers, to talk to the car dealers and find out what an appropriate number is. And back in the good old days when reporters were a little bit harder working, they would have done their own research and found out what the real inflation rate is. Now, the next thing I'm going to look at is used cars. On the official numbers, they claim that used cars, or the cost of having a used car, has gone up about 16%. I have talked to a variety of car dealers from various different places in my diverse district. Everybody laughs at the idea that used cars have only gone up 16.1%. They all insist 30% a minimum, Glenn. So here's another number that's thrown out to calculate that I think it's 8.6% number the government claims, and they're just way off on the cost of a new car. And I think over time, cost of a used car, and if you buy a new car, of course, interest rates are going up as well, which further increases things. In any event, the point I'm trying to make is the amount of inflation is well over that 8.6%. And it's certainly double digits over that when you talk about housing, and double digits over that when you talk about used cars. Subjectively, talking to people who do the grocery shopping for the family, they believe that when they go through the checkout, their cost is up way more than the few percentage points, than the 10 percentage points that the federal government claims food at home has gone up the last year. I beg the American people to demand action on inflation. I'm trying to educate the American people that that action will inevitably have to mean undoing the out-of-control spending that took place around here in January or February. And as we do it, we're going to have to reduce the amount of government, but I don't think we can go on with these housing prices and these car prices for the rest of our lives. We want to get back to the days in which a young couple had a chance on affording a house. We want to go back to the days where you can eat like Americans are used to eating, not where you have to deal with, inferior foods just because you can't afford it anymore. We want to go back to the days in which you can buy the type of car that you'd like to buy. So I encourage my colleagues this year if possible, but if not, next year, and maybe we're going to have to wait 3 years for some of this, we've got to get the spending back down where it was when you could live life in America like Americans are used to. So, and I beg the other side when it comes to passing the new budget, preparing for the appropriation bills that are going to pass for the calendar year beginning October 1st, let's stop spending so much money. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Grothman. As we've stated many times, as we learned when I first came up here, there's really three really great things that have come out of Wisconsin. One is Harley-Davidson, two is cheese, and the other is Glenn Grothman.
Well, thank you. Now buy that cheese. Remember, June is Dairy Promotion.
Yes, sir. Next, we have possibly the only rice farmer that I know in Congress, and that I'll probably never, ever will know. It's my good friend